I kept my study locked for 12 years. The combination was Carol's birthday, April 9th, 1961. When my son married a woman who smiled too wide and lingered too long near my filing cabinets, I had a deadbolt installed above the existing knob and changed the key entirely. 3 weeks ago, my son called me from his apartment downtown, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, something happened. Serena went through the house while you were at your physical. She found the spare key to the study on your keyring hook. I think she made a copy." I put down my coffee and sat very still at the kitchen table for a long moment. I had been waiting for something like this. I hadn't known exactly what shape it would take, whether it would be a forged signature, a manipulated conversation, a legal challenge I'd have to fight in court. But I had known from the first night Caleb brought Serena through my front door and I watched her eyes move slowly across every corner of my living room like she was taking inventory, that something was coming. "Dad, are you there?" "I'm here, son," I told him. "I need you to stay calm and don't let her know you called me. I'll handle it." There was a pause on the line. "She's been asking me things," he said quietly, "about your accounts, about what happens to the house when you're gone. She said she was just curious, just being practical." I closed my eyes. Carol had warned me this day might come. Not about Serena specifically. Carol had died before Caleb met Serena, before he was even 30 years old and starting to think seriously about settling down. But Carol had warned me about the type. She'd grown up watching her own grandmother lose everything to a man who'd married her for her paid-off home and her late husband's pension. Carol had understood, in the quiet and methodical way she understood most things, that kindness without protection was just vulnerability with a prettier name. I told Caleb I would come over the following morning. I spent that evening in the study, going through every document in the fireproof cabinet, confirming that everything was exactly as it should be. The trust Carol and I had established through her estate attorney 15 years ago, 2 years before her diagnosis. The property deed, the investment account statements, the life insurance policy, and in a separate envelope at the back of the top drawer, a letter in Carol's handwriting, addressed to Caleb, that I had been carrying for 11 years and waiting for the right moment to give him. I hadn't given it to him yet because the right moment kept not arriving. He was too young, then too focused on his career, then too newly in love to hear what his mother had written. I'd told myself I was protecting him. I was beginning to understand that I might have been protecting myself from a difficult conversation. I had met Serena 14 months before the wedding. Caleb had been 32, and he'd come to Sunday dinner, glowing in the specific way men glow when they believe they've found something rare. He'd talked about her for 20 minutes before she arrived. "She was brilliant," he said. "She had great instincts for people. She made him feel like the most interesting man in any room." She arrived 40 minutes late, which she apologized for, with a laugh that was practiced enough to seem spontaneous. She was 26 at the time, put together in the way that suggests real effort concealed as effortlessness. Her handshake was firm. Her eye contact was steady. She complimented the house immediately, said she loved older homes, said there was character in the bones of a place like this. I noticed she said bones. Over dinner, she asked me thoughtful questions about my career. I'd spent 30 years as a civil engineer before retiring at 62, and she seemed genuinely curious, asking about projects, about the industry, about whether I missed working. But mixed in with those questions were others that didn't quite belong there. Did I find retirement expensive? Had I downsized my investments or kept them active? Was the house expensive to maintain alone? Each question was delivered casually, attached to a smile, framed as interest rather than assessment. Caleb didn't notice. He was watching her the way people watch things they can't believe they have. After she left that night, Caleb called from the driveway before driving away. "What do you think, Dad? Isn't she incredible?" "She seems very capable," I said carefully. He laughed. "That's not exactly the ringing endorsement I was hoping for." "Give me time to get to know her," I said. "And give yourself time to really know her too." He told me I was overthinking it. He told me I was protective in the way widowers become protective when their only child starts building a life that doesn't require them as much. He wasn't entirely wrong about that, and I held on to that possibility for a while, hoping my instincts were just grief wearing the costume of caution. They weren't. Over the following months, the questions continued. They shifted from dinner conversation to comments Caleb relayed to me secondhand. Serena thought it was such a shame that a house this size was just sitting here with one person in it. Serena had mentioned to Caleb that it might make financial sense for them to eventually move in and split the costs of upkeep. Serena had asked Caleb whether I'd thought about estate planning, whether I'd kept my will updated, whether I had a financial advisor. I had a financial advisor. I also had an attorney I'd been consulting with quietly for 8 months by the time Caleb told me he was going to propose. He came to the house on a Thursday evening and sat across from me at the kitchen table with a small velvet box. The ring had belonged to Carol's mother. He'd called me 6 months earlier to ask if he could have it, and I'd said yes because it was his to have, and because I'd believed then that he would find someone worthy of it. Looking at his face in that moment, lit up with certainty and hope, I didn't have the heart to say what I was thinking. I hugged him. I told him I was happy for him. I told him Carol would have wanted him to have that ring and that whoever he chose to give it to was lucky. Then I called my attorney the next morning and asked her to walk me through every protection we had in place and every gap that remained. The prenuptial agreement was my idea, but I made sure it didn't appear to come from me. My attorney presented it to Serena's attorney as standard practice for any marriage involving an estate above a certain value. Serena had signed it 4 days before the wedding. I'd heard through Caleb that she'd complained about it privately, called it insulting, said it suggested the family didn't trust her, but she'd signed it. I suspected she'd calculated that the cost of losing the wedding was higher than the cost of signing a document she believed she could eventually work around. The wedding itself was expensive in the specific way that weddings become expensive when one person is determined to demonstrate a certain kind of life. The venue was a renovated estate outside the city. The flowers were elaborate. The catering was the most expensive option on the list Caleb had shown me with an expression that tried to be casual and failed. I gave them $25,000 as a wedding gift. Serena had kissed my cheek at the reception and called me the most generous father-in-law she could have imagined. Her eyes were warm and her smile was practiced, and I thought about Carol. They moved into Caleb's apartment after the honeymoon. He'd bought it 4 years earlier with his own money, a 2-bedroom downtown near his office. Within 3 months, Serena had begun suggesting it wasn't enough space. They needed a home, not an apartment. They needed a yard. They needed a neighborhood. She said it to Caleb in the indirect way that became her signature approach, not as a demand, but as a dream, something she shared with him in the dark, like a wish. Caleb mentioned it to me one Sunday. He said Serena had been looking at houses, said it might be nice to have more space for when they started a family. I told him that was a fine idea, and that I'd be happy to help them think through what they could afford. He came back the following week and told me Serena had actually been thinking it made more sense to look for something in my neighborhood, something close, that the houses near me were bigger and had more character, that they'd been saving and could potentially put down a significant amount if I was willing to contribute. I told him I wasn't in a position to contribute to a home purchase right now, that my assets were tied up in ways that couldn't be easily liquidated. He relayed this to Serena, and she shifted strategy within the week. The new suggestion, which again arrived, filtered through Caleb as though it were a natural idea that had occurred to both of them, was that it might make more sense for them to move into the house with me, save money, spend more time together as a family. My house had 3 bedrooms. I was alone. It seemed practical. I told Caleb that I valued my privacy and that I wasn't ready for that kind of arrangement. I also told him, as directly as I'd managed to be until that point, that I had concerns about the pattern of conversations he was bringing to me, not about him, about the direction those conversations seemed to come from. He got quiet in the way he got quiet when he felt criticized. He said I was being unfair to Serena. He said she was just trying to build something with him. He said I had never really given her a chance. I told him I loved him and that I hoped I was wrong. I was not wrong. I arrived at Caleb's apartment the morning after his phone call at 9:15. He buzzed me up without a word. He was standing in the kitchen when I came in, still in yesterday's clothes, holding a coffee mug like it was something to grip rather than drink. Serena was sitting at the dining table with her phone face down in front of her. She looked up when I walked in, and her expression was something between defensive and triumphant, like a person who has been caught at something but has decided the best response is offense. "Martin," she said. "Good morning." I sat down across from her without being invited to. Caleb came and stood at the edge of the kitchen, not quite joining either of us. "You went into my study," I said. "I wasn't asking." Her chin came up slightly. "I was at the house to water the plants while you were at your appointment. Caleb asked me to. I noticed the key on the hook. That key opens the front door, not the study." She held my gaze. The door to the study was already cracked open. "I wasn't snooping, Martin. I was concerned. You live alone. You're 67 years old. We just wanted to understand what we're dealing with, what the family situation actually looks like, in case something ever happened." "We," I said. She glanced at Caleb. I turned to my son. "Did you ask her to go into the study?" He set down his mug. He looked like he hadn't slept. "No," he said. "I didn't." Serena's posture shifted, almost imperceptibly. She recalibrated. "I was going to tell you," she said to Caleb, and her voice had shifted into something softer, something that sounded like honesty but was constructed very carefully. "I saw some of the documents. I just wanted to understand what your father has been planning for your future. It affects us. It affects our family." "What did you see?" I asked. She looked back at me. "Enough to know that you've structured everything so that I would never have any claim to it, even after being part of this family for years." I kept my voice even. "The trust was established 15 years ago, before you and Caleb met, long before you were part of anything. Trusts can be amended," she said. "They can," I agreed, "by the person who created them." She let that sit for a moment. Then she leaned forward slightly. "Martin, I know you don't like me. You've never really given me a fair shot. You made up your mind about me before you knew anything, and you've spent 2 years looking for proof. That's not protection. That's just control dressed up in better language." "I've spent 2 years paying attention," I said. "There's a difference." "What have you seen?" She spread her hands open. "What have I done that's so terrible? I married your son. I've supported him. I've tried to make a home with him. What crime have I committed?" "You haven't worked since the wedding," I said. "Caleb mentioned about 8 months ago that you'd left your job to pursue some freelance consulting work. That was 8 months ago. I'm curious how that's going." Something shifted in her expression. "I've been building something. It takes time." Caleb was very still, near the kitchen doorway. "You left the marketing job you had before the wedding," I continued, 3 weeks after you came back from the honeymoon. You told Caleb it was toxic, that you'd been underpaid, that you had enough saved to take a few months and figure out your next step. That was 22 months ago. Caleb has been covering all shared expenses since then. His salary, his savings, his energy. "I manage the household," she said. "That has value. The apartment has a cleaning service that costs $180 a month," I said. Caleb showed me the bank statement a while back, without realizing I was paying that much attention. "The household management argument has limits." "Caleb," Serena said, turning toward him. "Are you going to say something?" He was looking at his shoes. She turned back to me. "You've been going through his finances. You've been involving yourself in the details of our private life. That's an invasion of... He's my son. When he mentions things over Sunday dinner, I listen. When he seems stressed about money, I ask questions. That's not investigation. That's parenting." She sat back in her chair. "Fine. Yes, I've struggled to find the right fit professionally. The market has been difficult. That doesn't make me the villain you've decided I am." "The house," I said. "Let's talk about the house." A pause. "You've brought up the idea of moving into my house 4 separate times in the past 18 months. You've told Caleb I'm too old to manage the upkeep alone. You've mentioned 3 times that the property is too large for one person. Last month, when Caleb told me you'd suggested having a contractor come by to assess what updates might be needed, updates to my house that you would oversee, I called my attorney." Serena stared at me. The house is held in trust. The investment accounts are held in trust. The life insurance policy names Caleb as the sole beneficiary, with the proceeds going directly into the trust rather than to him personally. Even if you remain married to my son for 50 years, there is no legal mechanism by which you gain direct access to any of it. The prenuptial agreement you signed confirmed that all premarital and inherited assets remain separate property. I had my attorney confirm its enforceability 6 weeks ago. It's airtight. The silence in the apartment had a particular quality, the kind that forms when the air has been taken out of something. "You did all of this," she said finally. "All of this planning, all of this preparation, and you never once told your son." Caleb looked up then. His jaw was tight. I looked at my son. "You're right that I should have told you sooner. That's on me. I kept waiting for the right time. And I told myself I was waiting because you were happy and I didn't want to introduce doubt into something that made you feel good. But honestly, there were times I tried to say something and you shut the door on it, not cruelly, just firmly. I mentioned my concerns twice in the first year, and both times you told me I was being overprotective. I should have pushed harder. I didn't. I'm sorry for that." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at his wife. Serena was watching both of us, recalculating. "This doesn't change anything," she said. "We're married. Whatever your arrangements are with your attorney, whatever you've set up, Caleb is still entitled to know what he's entitled to. He's your son. He shouldn't be in the dark about his own inheritance." "He won't be anymore," I said. "That's exactly why I'm here this morning. I owe him the full picture, and I'm going to give it to him. But I'm going to give it to him alone." She went very still. "Caleb," I said, "I'd like to take you to the house. There are things I want to show you. Things your mother left that I've been holding on to for too long." He looked at Serena. She looked back at him, and I watched the calculation happen behind her eyes. She'd already lost the element of surprise. She'd lost the advantage of secrecy. The only card she had left was him. And she knew it. "Caleb," she said quietly, "you don't have to go anywhere you don't want to go. You're allowed to make your own choices." He stood there for a moment. This son of mine who had Carol's patience, and her stubborn streak, and her way of seeing the best in people, until he couldn't anymore. "I'll be back later," he said to her. She didn't respond. We drove to the house in separate cars. I watched him in my rearview mirror the whole way and thought about how he'd looked as a boy, following me around the garage on Saturday mornings while I worked on whatever needed fixing. He'd been the kind of child who wanted to understand how things worked. He'd asked more questions than most children and accepted vague answers less easily than most children. I had always loved that about him, and I'd understood for a while now that it was partly why Serena had been so careful to drip her suggestions through him slowly rather than stating them directly. She'd known, on some level, that he needed to believe ideas were his own. Inside the house, he followed me to the study. I punched in the code, and the deadbolt clicked back. He stepped inside behind me and stood in the center of the room while I went to the fireproof cabinet. "Your mother established this trust 2 years before she was diagnosed," I said. "Not because she knew she was sick, because she'd watched her grandmother lose everything when she remarried after your grandfather died, and she never forgot what that looked like. She understood that kindness and financial vulnerability aren't the same thing, even if they can look similar from the outside." Caleb moved slowly around the room. He stopped at the bookshelf along the far wall, where Carol's medical texts were still lined up from her years as a hospital administrator. She'd been meticulous about books. She'd kept them organized by subject, and I'd never rearranged them. "She put everything into the trust," I said. "The house, the investment accounts we'd built together over 25 years, the life insurance." Her attorney was thorough. "The trust is structured so that you have full access when you turn 40, or earlier if I choose to transfer control before then. You've always been the sole beneficiary. That's never changed." "How much?" Caleb asked. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the books. "The house is worth around $700,000 in the current market. The investment accounts are a little over $900,000. The life insurance is paid out into the trust. So when I die, there's an additional $400,000. Total, somewhere around $2 million, depending on the market." He turned. His face was very still, in the way faces get when a person is working hard to keep their expression neutral. Mom set this up when I was 22, he said. 21, I said. You were finishing your junior year of college, and she never told me. She didn't want you growing up with a number attached to your future. She wanted you to build your own career, your own confidence, without the distraction of knowing you had a safety net below you. The plan was always to tell you when the time was right. I held onto that plan maybe longer than I should have. He sat down in the chair across from my desk. He was quiet for a minute. The prenuptial agreement, he said. That was you. Yes. He nodded slowly. You could have just told me you were concerned. You could have said, Caleb, I have a bad feeling. I want to make sure there's protection in place. Can we talk about this before the wedding? You could have done that. I could have, I said. And I tried, twice, to start that conversation, and both times you told me I was being unfair to Serena before I'd gotten to the important part. I should have pushed through that. I'm not saying you were wrong to defend her. I'm saying I should have been more direct regardless of the discomfort. That's my failure, and I own it. He rubbed his face with both hands. I opened the top drawer of the fireproof cabinet and took out the envelope. Carol's handwriting on the front, his name in blue ink, her particular way of forming the letters. I'd looked at it so many times over 11 years that I knew the slight slant of the C, the deliberate loop of the B. Your mother wrote this about 2 weeks before she died, I said. She asked me to give it to you when I felt the time was right. I've been carrying it longer than I should have. He took it. He held it without opening it for a moment, turning it over in his hands, looking at her handwriting. Then he opened it and read. I stood near the window and watched the street outside while he read. I'd memorized the letter years ago, having read it once when Carol pressed it into my hand, and then never again after that, not wanting to violate the privacy of something she'd intended
only for him.
But I knew what it said in its broad strokes. She'd written about the trust, about why she'd set it up, about the specific fear that had driven her grandmother's face, the day the second husband emptied the savings account, the look of a woman who had trusted and had that trust used against her like a key to a lock she'd thought was safe. She'd written about Caleb specifically, about the way his heart worked, his generosity, his tendency to assume that people who loved him meant it the way he meant it. She'd written that this wasn't a flaw. She'd written that it was one of the things she loved most about him. But she'd also written that the world contained people who would recognize that quality and decide it was something to use rather than something to cherish, and that she wanted him protected from those people, even if he never needed that protection. And she'd written something at the end that I hadn't known about, a last paragraph she'd added after she'd given me the sealed envelope. I only knew what it said because Caleb read it aloud without quite seeming to realize he was doing it, his voice rough. He said, she wrote, I'm not asking you to be suspicious of everyone. I'm asking you to pay attention to how people act when they think they have nothing to gain. Generosity under observation is performance. Generosity in private is character. Find someone who has the second kind. That's the person worth trusting with everything. He folded the letter. He sat there for a long time. She knew, he said finally. She knew this might happen. Not Serena specifically, but the possibility. Your mother was very clear-eyed about certain things. I've been making every payment on the car lease for 14 months, he said. It's in my name. She picked it out. I thought I told myself she just had better taste than me, that she was just enthusiastic about having reliable transportation. He laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. 14 months at $640 a month. I ran the numbers in my head 2 nights ago, lying in bed. That's over $9,000. And she hasn't filed taxes in 2 years because she said her income was below the threshold. I believed her. You wanted to believe her, I said. That's not stupidity. That's just love. When did you know? He asked. Really know. The first dinner? I said honestly. The way she moved through the rooms, the questions she asked about retirement plans. I'd seen that specific kind of attention before, not greed exactly, more like a person mentally converting everything they see into a number. Your mother would have clocked it in about 10 minutes. He was quiet for a moment. You should have said something then. Yes, even if I didn't listen. You should have said it so I couldn't say later that you never warned me. You're right, I said. And I'm sorry. I kept thinking I was protecting you by not forcing a conflict before there was one. What I was actually doing was protecting myself from the possibility that you'd choose her, and I'd lose you both. He looked up at me. That was selfish, I said. More selfish than protective. I should have been honest with you and let you make your own decision with the full information. I didn't do that, and if you need to be angry at me for it, that's fair. He was quiet again for a long time. Then he said, "What do I do now?" We went back to the apartment together. That hadn't been my initial plan, but Caleb asked me to come, and I understood why. There are conversations a person needs a witness for, not for support exactly, but for the grounding quality of another presence in the room. Serena was on the couch when we came in. She'd changed clothes and done her makeup while we were gone, which told me something about how she'd spent the intervening hours. She looked composed, prepared. "Caleb," she said, "can we talk privately?" Caleb stood in the center of the room. He had Carol's way of gathering himself before saying something difficult, a stillness that people sometimes mistook for hesitation but was actually the opposite. He said, "I've been going through our shared account statements for the last 2 hours." She went very still. "Since the wedding," he said, "I've contributed $108,000 to our shared finances. That includes rent, utilities, groceries, your car lease, the trip to Costa Rica last spring, your gym membership, the new furniture for the bedroom, the kitchen renovation you said you'd pay for with your freelance income. I've been through 14 months of bank records. Your deposits into that account total $900. That was once, in March, and you told me it was a check from a freelance client." Serena opened her mouth. He continued, "I called the freelance consulting firm you told me you'd registered. There's no record of it with the state business registry." Her face had gone carefully neutral. "You lied," he said. "Not once, not occasionally. Consistently, for the entire length of our marriage, you told me you were working towards something, a client, a contract, a plan, and none of it was real." She stood up. Her composure was still intact, but it was working hard. "Caleb, you don't understand the kind of pressure I've been under. The consulting work fell through multiple times. The market for my specific skills is incredibly competitive right now. I didn't want to stress you out with the details. I was handling it." "You've been handling it for 22 months, he said. "And in that time, your father paid for your sister's wedding present on your behalf because you told him you were between clients." "I know, because he called me last month to ask if everything was okay. He was worried about you." Something flickered across her face. "What was your plan?" Caleb asked. "Not what you told me the plan was. What was it actually?" The room was very quiet. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at me, and I watched the mask come off. Not dramatically, not in the way it happens in movies, but gradually, like a person who has decided that maintaining the performance is no longer worth the energy. She said, "I thought you had more than you do." Caleb blinked. "I thought the house was yours," she said, "or at least partially yours. I thought by now we'd be living there, that the equity would be part of our future. I thought the accounts your father talks around were going to be accessible within a reasonable amount of time. I thought a lot of things that turned out to not be true." "So you stayed," Caleb said slowly, "because you were waiting for access to money." "I stayed because I cared about you," she said, and the defensive note was back in her voice. "I stayed because we have a life together. But yes, I also thought that life included financial security. That's not a crime. Everyone considers finances when they get married. You just don't admit it." "I considered your finances," Caleb said. "I thought about whether I could support us on my salary while you built your business. I factored in your timeline. I adjusted my own savings goals to accommodate your stated plan. I did all of that in good faith. What you're describing is different." She said nothing. "You didn't consider our finances," he continued. "You considered my father's finances. That's what you were actually calculating. And when you found out they weren't going to be available to you the way you thought, you started pushing. The house, moving in, the renovations, the estate planning questions. That wasn't being practical. That was looking for a way in." He ran his hand along the back of the couch. His voice was very even. My mother set up a trust when I was 21 because she grew up watching what happened when a family's security was left unguarded, he said. She spent the last months of her life making sure I'd be protected, and I almost handed that protection to someone who was sitting across the table from my father, asking him about his retirement plans on her very first visit to his house. Serena's expression shifted. There was real anger in it now, unfiltered. You want to talk about your mother? Fine. Let's talk about the fact that your father has kept you in the dark for your entire adult life, pulling strings behind the scenes, arranging things without your knowledge or consent. That's not protection. That's control. He never trusted you to make your own decisions. He made them for you and let you believe you were choosing freely. My father told me the truth this morning, Caleb said. He told me he should have been more direct sooner and that he was wrong not to be. He said it plainly and without making excuses. He sat in a room with me for 2 hours and answered every question I had. He paused. I've been asking you questions about your work situation for 22 months, and I've gotten a different excuse every time. There's a difference between someone who made a mistake in how they protected you and someone who made a plan to take advantage of you. I know which one I'm looking at. The silence stretched. Serena picked up her phone from the coffee table. She turned it over once in her hand, then set it back down. Her jaw was tight. If you're asking me to leave, she said, you should know that I have rights here. This apartment may be in your name, but I've been living here as your spouse for over 2 years. There are legal protections. I've already spoken with an attorney, I said. She said the same thing. Caleb's apartment, purchased before the marriage and titled in his name alone, is separate property in this state. Your protections are to your personal belongings, the contents of the joint account, and anything that can be demonstrated as a direct marital contribution. Given the financial picture we've just reviewed, that's going to be a limited argument. She looked at me with an expression that had stopped pretending. You had this whole thing prepared, she said. The attorney, the trust, the prenuptial agreement, all of it. Before I'd done anything, I had it prepared. Because people like you exist, I said. Not because I knew it would be you specifically, because Carol knew it might be someone, and she made sure I knew what to do. Serena looked at Caleb one last time. Her expression had shifted into something that was almost sad, but not the kind of sadness that comes from remorse. The kind that comes from losing. I need a week, she said, to arrange somewhere to go. I'm not going to a hotel. You have 2 days, Caleb said. The joint account has what it has. You're welcome to your half of it. He walked to the door and opened it. Not as a gesture of aggression, just as a statement of fact. She left without saying anything else. Caleb and I stood in the apartment after she'd gone. He stood at the window and I stayed near the door, and neither of us said anything for a long time. He watched the street below, and I watched him. And I thought about Carol with an intensity that I hadn't allowed myself in years. The specific weight of missing a person who had known you better than you'd sometimes known yourself. She would have handled that better than I did, I said finally. He shook his head. She would have cried in a different room and then come out and said exactly the right thing. He paused. And she would have known how to say, I told you so, without it feeling like I told you so. Your mother had gifts. He turned from the window. Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me. Always. Was there any part of you that wanted this to happen? That wanted to be right about Serena so badly that you made it more likely to happen? I thought about that for a moment. I thought about it genuinely, the way he deserved. No, I said. Every day I hoped I was wrong. I would have happily spent the rest of my life being wrong about her, watching you be happy, watching her prove me a bad judge of character. There is nothing about this that feels like a victory. I have watched my son's marriage end this morning, and I'm standing here feeling the particular misery of a parent who did everything right and is still watching their child get hurt. He nodded. He believed me. I could see it. She never asked about Mom, he said quietly. Not once. Not what she was like. Not what she enjoyed. Not what I missed about her. She saw her photograph in the living room and said she had a lovely face, and that was it. That was the whole of her curiosity. I know. You can love someone's money and their security and their future without loving them, he said. And it doesn't look that different from the outside. It uses the same words, the same gestures. It answers the same questions in the same tone of voice. That's one of the hardest lessons there is, I said. I don't want to be angry at her, he said. I want to be, but I'm more just tired. I feel like I've been running towards something for 2.5 years, and I just looked down and realized the road ended a long way back. I moved across the room and put my hand on his shoulder. He didn't shrug it off. Can we go back to the house? He said. I want to look through Mom's things. Whatever you have in the study, I want to see all of it. We spent that evening in the study. I opened every drawer and every box and every album I'd been carefully maintaining for 11 years, and I let my son go through it all. He took his time. He didn't rush, and I didn't hurry him. He looked at photographs from before he was born, from his parents' life before it included him, the versions of Carol and me that existed in our early 30s, young and unaware of what was coming, and somehow still right about most of the important things. He found her handwritten recipe cards in a wooden box she'd kept in the back of the bottom drawer, recipes she'd clipped from magazines and annotated in her neat blue ink. He found her graduate thesis from 1988, bound in dark green cloth, her name embossed on the spine. He found a birthday card she'd sent me the year after her first round of treatment. All clear, the doctors had said, and she'd written inside, "We get more time, let's not waste any of it." He held on to that card for a long time. We didn't eat dinner until 9 o'clock. I made pasta from memory, a dish Carol had made every Saturday for 20 years, and I got it almost right. We ate at the kitchen table and talked about things that weren't about Serena or trusts or attorneys. He told me about a project at work he was excited about. I told him about the neighbor's dog who'd been appearing in my backyard every afternoon for a week and who I'd begun leaving water out for. He laughed at that. He asked about the scholarship idea. I'd mentioned it in passing a few weeks earlier, just a thought I'd been turning over, something I'd read about in a newsletter from the hospital where Carol had been treated, a fund that helped families whose primary earner died of cancer and whose children struggled with college costs. She would have wanted something like that, he said. Something real. Something that kept moving after we were gone. I think so too. We should do it properly, he said. Not just donate to an existing fund. Set something up in her name through the hospital, with the foundation, something that pays for at least 2 or 3 students a year. He paused. We could use some of the trust. You said the investment accounts are healthy. I don't need that much money. I have my own career, my own savings. I don't need $2 million to live on. You're 34. I know. But I also know I didn't become who I am because of money. I became who I am because of her. He glanced around the kitchen. Because of Sunday mornings in this house. Because of that recipe box in there. Because she wrote me a letter when she was dying that I can carry in my pocket and read when I need to remember what actually matters. He looked at me. The money is the least of what she left me. I had to look away. The window above the sink. The dark yard beyond it. The neighbor's fence where the dog had appeared every afternoon at 4, regular as a clock, looking for the water bowl I'd started leaving out. Carol, I thought. He turned out okay. Better than okay, actually. He turned out extraordinary, and most of the credit belonged to her, to the choices she'd made with what time she'd had, to a trust document, and a letter, and 21 years of raising a person to understand that character was the only thing that couldn't be taken from you. The divorce took 4 months. The prenuptial agreement held exactly as my attorney had said it would. Serena's lawyer reviewed the documents and advised her to accept the terms, which she did, not without a final phone call to Caleb in which she made one last attempt to reframe everything that had happened as the consequence of my controlling influence over his life. He listened to the whole call. Then he thanked her for the years they'd had and said goodbye. He told me about it over Sunday dinner 3 weeks later, sitting at the same kitchen table where we'd eaten pasta the night she moved out. She said I would always be under your thumb, he told me, cutting into the roast I'd managed not to ruin, that I'd never have a real partnership because you'd always be in the background evaluating whoever I was with. What did you say? He thought about it for a moment. I said she was partly right. That you do evaluate the people I bring into my life, and that you did it with her, and that in her case, you were correct. And then I said that someday I hoped to introduce him to someone who would make him look bad at evaluating people, and I was looking forward to that day. I laughed. He grinned. "Her name is Ruth," he said, and the ease with which he said it told me something important. I looked up. "We've had 3 dinners," he said carefully. "She's a structural engineer. We met at a conference in Seattle last month. She grew up in Vermont. She has a 9-year-old nephew who she's teaching to play chess, which I find extremely endearing. And on our first dinner, when the check came, she took it before I could and said she had a rule about paying her own way until at least the 4th date. I felt something settle in my chest. Smart woman. That's what I said. "I'd like to meet her," I said. "When the time is right. No rush. Whatever makes sense." He nodded. "I was thinking maybe in a few weeks. A Sunday dinner. Nothing formal." I thought about Carol. About what she would have said across the table if she were sitting there. About the letter she'd written, now worn soft at the folds from being carried and read and reread. About the woman who'd cleaned houses to put herself through college, and who had looked at the world clearly enough to know that love, without protection, was just hope waiting to be disappointed, and who had loved her son so much that she'd spent the last clear-headed months of her life making sure he'd be safe after she was gone. The study was still locked. The code was still April 9th. I'd thought about changing it a dozen times over the years and had never managed to do it, because every time I punched in those numbers, I was reminded of what I was protecting and why. And that reminder had kept me doing the right thing, even on the days when doing the right thing had been uncomfortable and thankless, and had cost me something in my relationship with my son. He understood that now. He told me he understood it, which was worth something. But more than his words was the evidence of what he'd done with the understanding, the way he'd sat across from his wife and spoken plainly, without cruelty but without softening the truth either. Carol's quality, her ability to look at a hard thing directly and say what she saw. After dinner, we sat on the back porch the way we'd started doing these last few months, the weather finally warming into late spring, the yard green and unhurried. He had a cup of coffee, and I had my second glass of wine from a bottle Carol had chosen 15 years ago at a vineyard in Sonoma, a bottle she'd been saving for something significant. I decided that significant was no longer a future event. Significant was tonight. It was most Sundays now. "Dad," he said, after a while. "Yeah, thank you for keeping the lock on." He was looking at the yard, the old maple at the back, the flower beds. I kept up more out of stubbornness than skill. His voice was quiet in the way that meant he meant it fully. I almost said the easy thing, the thing that would have kept the emotion at bay and let us move on to something lighter. Instead, I said, "Thank you for coming back to look at what was behind it." He nodded. He drank his coffee. The neighbor's dog appeared at the fence at its usual hour, hopeful, waiting. I'd started leaving the water bowl out before dinner, specifically so it would be ready. Caleb saw the bowl and looked at me. "His name is Oscar," I said. "According to the neighbor. He's here every single afternoon. You've been feeding the neighbor's dog. Just water." He smiled. "You're turning into someone's grandfather." I was quiet for a moment, looking at the yard, the old maple, the flower beds, the dog at the fence. "I'd be okay with that," I said. We sat there until it got dark, the two of us, in a house that was finally free of secrets and still standing.